Right. If I was a dealer, you'd be dead by now. Turn shit down on the street.
He came up with the line at Training Day. Okay, whoa. Let me quarterback this thing. Where did that come from, that line?
That might have been in the script. I didn't ad-lib that.
Now, some people, including myself, see Training Day as a point where you took a drastic turn in terms of the characters you're playing. Now that may be because I and they haven't seen a previous film where you took a drastic turn.
The cast of Training Day has finally revealed what you never figured out. From Ethan Hawke's genuine fear on set.
Tell me a story.
Wait. Like my story?
No, not your story, a story.
To the real gang members who influenced the story.
Hands on the side of the glass. Straight ahead. Put it in park. Grab the keys and throw them out the window. Grab the keys and throw them out.
These are the secrets that the cast is still dealing with over 2 decades later. So, let's get into it. The story of Training Day began in the mind of screenwriter David Ayer, a man whose personal experiences with Los Angeles street life gave him access to truths that most Hollywood writers could only imagine. Ayer wasn't crafting a fictional narrative from research and interviews. He was drawing from his own dangerous encounters with the corrupt underbelly of law enforcement in South Central Los Angeles during some of the city's most violent years.
Yeah, right. If I was a dealer, you'd be dead by now. You turn shit down on the street.
Growing up in South Central during the crack epidemic, Ayer witnessed firsthand how the war on drugs had transformed certain police officers from protectors into predators. The neighborhood he called home was a battleground where the line between law enforcement and criminal enterprise had become so blurred that sometimes there was no difference at all. These weren't stories he had heard secondhand or read in newspapers. They were memories burned into his consciousness from years of survival in an environment where trust could get you killed. When Ayer sat down to write the screenplay that would become Training Day, he wasn't trying to create entertainment. He was attempting to translate his lived experience into a narrative that would expose truths about police corruption that most of America preferred to ignore.
One thing I did is I went to acting class. You know, I didn't participate because you would never want to see me act. It'd be horrible. But to understand how do they learn and how do they talk about their craft.
The character of Alonzo Harris wasn't born from imagination. He was a composite of real officers Ayer had encountered. Men who had taken the badge and twisted it into a license for exploitation and violence. The script that emerged from Ayer's typewriter was unlike anything Hollywood had seen before. It wasn't the typical good cop versus bad cop narrative that audiences were accustomed to. Instead, it was a psychological horror story dressed as a police thriller, a deep dive into how power without accountability could transform a human being into something monstrous. The authenticity in every line of dialogue came from places that entertainment executives had never been and never wanted to go. The challenge became finding a director who could handle both the artistic demands of the material and the real-world implications of bringing such a story to the screen. The script needed someone who understood that they weren't just making a movie. They were documenting a reality that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. The wrong approach could result in a film that either sanitized Ayer's truth or sensationalized it to the point where its message would be lost in spectacle. When director Antoine Fuqua signed on to helm the project, he brought with him an understanding that Training Day would require a different approach than typical Hollywood productions.
A few gang members, Bone, I remember Bone walked over to me and goes, "Oh shit, man, this movie's a hit, man. This movie's gone." And that was the first thing I shot.
Fuqua recognized that the script's power came from its unflinching examination of corruption, and that any attempt to soften its edges would destroy what made it special. He committed to preserving Ayer's vision, even when that commitment would lead the production into territories that made everyone involved deeply uncomfortable. The decision to cast Denzel Washington as Alonzo Harris was one of the most controversial and risky choices in modern Hollywood history. Washington had spent his entire career building a reputation as the embodiment of dignity, integrity, and moral authority on screen. From Malcolm X to the Hurricane, he had become America's most trusted leading man, someone audiences automatically associated with heroism and righteousness. Asking him to play a corrupt, manipulative, and ultimately evil police officer wasn't just casting against type. It was asking him to destroy decades of carefully cultivated public image.
Okay. All right. I'm putting cases on all you huh? You think you can do this?
When Washington first read Ayer's script, his initial reaction was shock at the darkness of the material and the complexity of Alonzo's character. This wasn't a simple villain role where the audience would know from the beginning that they were watching the bad guy. Instead, Alonzo was written as someone who could genuinely convince viewers, and his rookie partner Jake Hoyt, that his methods, however extreme, were necessary for survival in the war zone of South Central Los Angeles. The actor understood that accepting the role would require him to access parts of his personality that he had never explored on screen before. Alonzo wasn't just corrupt, he was charismatic, intelligent, and absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. Washington would need to find a way to make this character believable and even sympathetic without betraying the script's ultimate condemnation of everything Alonzo represented. Preparation for the role took Washington into psychological territory he had never explored before. He studied real cases of police corruption, interviewed former officers who had crossed the line, and spent time in neighborhoods where the events of Training Day could realistically unfold. The research was disturbing and transformative, showing him how easily good intentions could be corrupted by power and how the badge could become a weapon against the very communities it was meant to protect. The casting of Ethan Hawke as Jake Hoyt presented its own challenges. Hawke was known primarily for independent films and romantic dramas, not intense police thrillers. His relatively slight build and intellectual demeanor made him an unlikely choice for a role that would require him to hold his own against Washington's intimidating presence while representing the moral center of the story.
Now, some people, including myself, see Training Day as a point where you took a drastic turn in terms of the characters you're playing. Now that may be because I and they haven't seen a previous film where you took a drastic turn.
However, Hawke's casting proved to be genius in its own way. His natural vulnerability and obvious discomfort with the violent world of the film made Jake's journey more believable and emotionally resonant. Audiences could see themselves in Hawke's position, an ordinary person thrown into extraordinary circumstances and forced to make impossible choices. His fear wasn't acting. It was a genuine response to the intensity of the material and the authenticity of the world they were creating. The chemistry between Washington and Hawke was immediately apparent during their first scenes together, but it wasn't the comfortable collaboration that might be expected between two professional actors. Instead, it was a relationship built on genuine tension, with Hawke's real nervousness feeding into his character's fear and Washington's commanding presence becoming increasingly menacing as he settled into Alonzo's mindset.
Tell me a story. Wait.
Like my story?
No, not your story, a story.
Supporting cast members were chosen specifically for their ability to bring authenticity to the world of the film. Many were actors who had actually grown up in the neighborhoods where Training Day was set, bringing with them an understanding of the environment that no amount of research could replicate. Others were chosen for their ability to represent the various faces of corruption and survival that the story demanded. Each casting choice was made with the understanding that the film's power would depend on its believability, and that believability would require performers who understood the reality behind the fiction. The decision to film Training Day in actual South Central Los Angeles locations, rather than sanitized studio backlots, brought a level of authenticity to the production that also introduced very real dangers for everyone involved. Director Antoine Fuqua insisted that the film's power would depend on its believability, and that believability could only be achieved by filming in the actual neighborhoods where stories like Alonzo and Jake's played out every day.
Who came up with the line in Training Day? Okay, whoa. Let me quarterback this thing. Where did that come from, that line?
That might have been in the script. I didn't ad-lib that.
The production team quickly discovered that filming in these locations meant entering territories where their presence wasn't necessarily welcome and where the wrong move could have consequences that extended far beyond the movie set. Many of the neighborhoods they needed to access were controlled by gangs who viewed the film crew's presence as either an opportunity or a threat, depending on how the production handled their interactions with local power structures. Security for the production became a complex operation that involved negotiations with community leaders, gang members, and local residents who had to be convinced that the film wouldn't exploit or misrepresent their experiences. The production hired security consultants who understood the intricate politics of South Central neighborhoods, people who could navigate the relationships necessary to ensure that filming could proceed without incident. Real gang members and former criminals were hired as consultants and extras, bringing an authenticity to crowd scenes and background action that no amount of casting could have achieved. However, their presence also meant that the set was populated with individuals whose loyalties and motivations weren't always clear. Cast and crew members never knew whether the person standing next to them was an actor playing a gang member, or an actual gang member playing themselves.
Police officers, let's see it. Put your hands up. Put them up. Put them up. Grab them right side back. Your hands on the windshield. Put them on the windshield.
The famous scene in the Imperial Court's housing project required particularly delicate negotiations with residents and local power brokers. The housing project had a reputation as one of the most dangerous areas in Los Angeles, and filming there meant entering territory where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and where violence was a constant possibility. The production team had to prove that they weren't there to exploit or sensationalize the residents' struggles, but to tell a story that reflected their reality. Local residents who appeared in the film brought with them stories and experiences that were often more dramatic and disturbing than anything in Ayer's script. Their presence served as a constant reminder to the cast and crew that they were depicting real lives and real struggles, not just creating entertainment. This responsibility weighed heavily on everyone involved and influenced decisions about how scenes were filmed and what aspects of the story were emphasized. The authenticity that the production achieved came at a psychological cost for many of the people involved. Cast and crew members found themselves confronted with realities about urban America that they had never experienced before, forced to acknowledge the existence of worlds that existed parallel to but separate from mainstream society. The education was valuable but often overwhelming, changing how many of them viewed their own privilege and the responsibilities that came with telling stories about people whose lives were fundamentally different from their own. Law enforcement agencies were notably absent from the production's support structure, with many officers and departments viewing the film as an attack on police credibility and effectiveness. This lack of official cooperation meant that the production had to rely on unofficial sources and former officers for technical accuracy, some of whom had their own complicated relationships with the law enforcement community.
Hands on the side of the glass. Straight ahead. Put it in park. Grab the keys and throw them out the window. Grab the keys and throw them out the window. Put that.
The danger wasn't just physical, but also legal and professional. Everyone involved in the production understood that they were creating something that would be controversial, and that their association with the film could have career consequences. The commitment to authenticity meant accepting risks that went far beyond typical Hollywood productions, gambling reputations, and relationships on the belief that the story they were telling was important enough to justify those risks. The character of Alonzo Harris wasn't born from screenwriter David Ayer's imagination, but was instead a composite drawn from real LAPD officers whose corruption had become legendary in the neighborhoods where they operated. The most significant inspiration came from Rafael Perez, a former LAPD officer whose activities as part of the anti-gang unit known as CRASH became the center of one of the largest police corruption scandals in American history. Perez's story read like a crime novel, involving drug dealing, evidence planting, witness intimidation, and the systematic abuse of power that turned entire communities against law enforcement. His unit operated with impunity in some of Los Angeles's most troubled neighborhoods, using their badges as licenses to engage in exactly the kind of behavior that Alonzo exhibits throughout training day. The parallels between Perez's documented activities and Alonzo's fictional crimes were so direct that many viewers assumed they were watching a barely disguised biography. The crash unit's methods included many of the tactics that Alonzo uses to control his territory and manipulate his rookie partner. Officers would plant evidence, steal drugs and money from dealers, and use their knowledge of criminal activities to blackmail cooperation from unwilling informants. The unit's motto, "We intimidate those who intimidate others," became a justification for behavior that was often indistinguishable from the criminal activity they were supposedly fighting.
Son, this is the game I'm playing. That's my job. That's your job.
Ayer's research into police corruption extended beyond individual cases to examine the systematic factors that allowed such behavior to flourish. He discovered that officers like Perez weren't aberrations, but products of a system that rewarded aggressive enforcement while providing minimal oversight of how that enforcement was carried out. The war on drugs had created an environment where results mattered more than methods, and where officers who produced arrests and seizures were rarely questioned about their techniques. The real-world inspiration for Alonzo also came from officers who had never been caught or prosecuted, but whose reputations in certain neighborhoods were well known to residents who had no recourse for addressing their behavior. These were men who had learned to use their authority to extract tribute from drug dealers, to eliminate competition for favored informants, and to maintain personal fiefdoms within their assigned territories.
Hey, this man was the biggest major violator in Los Angeles.
I watched that operate with impunity for over 10 years, and now I got it.
Denzel Washington's preparation for the role included studying not just the documented cases of corruption, but also the psychology that allowed officers to justify their actions to themselves and others. He discovered that many corrupt officers genuinely believed they were serving a greater good, that their methods were necessary responses to an impossible situation, and that their communities were better served by their brand of rough justice than by strict adherence to constitutional procedures. The authenticity of Alonzo's character was enhanced by Ayer's decision to base specific scenes and dialogue on documented events from real corruption cases. The casual way Alonzo discusses planting evidence, the sophisticated methods he uses to launder money, and his detailed knowledge of criminal enterprises all reflected real-world expertise that could only come from officers who had crossed the line from law enforcement to criminal enterprise.
Take the money.
I already told you I'm not gonna take that. I'm not gonna take that.
Okay, don't just burn it.
The film's portrayal of how corruption spreads through a police unit was based on testimony from officers who had witnessed the process firsthand. Ayer understood that corruption wasn't usually a sudden decision, but rather a gradual process of small compromises, each one making the next transgression easier to justify. This understanding informed the way Jake's seduction and corruption are portrayed throughout the film. The real officers who inspired Alonzo's character were often charismatic leaders who could convince subordinates that their methods were not only necessary but morally superior to traditional law enforcement approaches. Their ability to manipulate idealistic young officers was a crucial element of how corruption spread. and it became central to the dynamic between Alonzo and Jake in the film. The intensity of Training Day's subject matter and the method acting approaches employed by the cast created an atmosphere on set that was unlike anything most crew members had experienced in their Hollywood careers. The combination of filming in dangerous locations with actors who remained partially in character between takes created a constant undercurrent of tension that affected every aspect of the production. Ethan Hawke's genuine discomfort with Denzel Washington's portrayal of Alonzo began to affect their off-camera relationship in ways that enhanced their on-screen chemistry, but made the filming process increasingly difficult for both actors. Washington's commitment to maintaining Alonzo's manipulative authority, even during breaks, meant that Hawke never felt completely safe or comfortable around his co-star, a dynamic that perfectly served the story but took a psychological toll on both performers. The famous restaurant scene where Alonzo introduces Jake to his criminal associates required multiple days of filming in a location that was frequented by real criminals and gang members.
On my squad, Jake Hoyt, Captain Lou Jacobs. You ever need to talk to the Fed, you talk to him first. Good man, he can take your back for you.
The cast and crew found themselves sharing space with individuals whose presence added authenticity to the scene, but also created an atmosphere where everyone had to remain constantly alert to potential dangers that had nothing to do with the fictional story they were telling. Director Antoine Fuqua's insistence on capturing genuine reactions from his actors sometimes meant pushing them into situations where their discomfort was real and their fear was authentic. This approach created powerful performances, but also raised ethical questions about the responsibility of directors to protect their cast from psychological harm in pursuit of artistic authenticity. The scene where Jake is forced to smoke PCP-laced marijuana became a source of significant tension between Hawke and Washington, with Hawke later admitting that he wasn't always certain how much of Washington's aggressive behavior was performance and how much was genuine intimidation.
Yeah, right. If I was a dealer, you'd be dead by now, motherfucker. You turn shit down on the street.
The blurring of lines between acting and reality became a defining characteristic of the production, but also a source of ongoing stress for everyone involved. Crew members reported feeling constantly on edge during filming, never quite certain whether they were witnessing scripted drama or real conflict between cast members. The method acting approaches being employed made it difficult to distinguish between performance and genuine interpersonal problems, creating an atmosphere where professional relationships became complicated by the psychological demands of the material. The supporting cast, many of whom were drawing from personal experiences with the neighborhoods and situations depicted in the film, brought their own emotional baggage to the production. Their authentic reactions to the story being told often involved genuine pain and trauma, making their scenes more powerful but also more difficult to film without causing real psychological harm. Washington's transformation into Alonzo was so complete that some cast and crew members began to avoid him when cameras weren't rolling, uncomfortable with the cold authority he maintained even during casual conversations. This isolation enhanced his performance but also created a working environment where the lead actor was cut off from the support system that typically helps performers navigate difficult roles. The authenticity that everyone was striving to achieve came at a cost that extended beyond the normal challenges of filmmaking. Cast and crew members found themselves dealing with real-world consequences of their commitment to truthful storytelling, including ongoing psychological effects that lasted long after filming wrapped. Security concerns that began as practical considerations for filming in dangerous locations evolved into genuine fear among some crew members who worried that their association with the film's controversial subject matter might make them targets for retaliation. The line between fictional danger and real threat became blurred in ways that no one had anticipated when the production began. Denzel Washington's portrayal of Alonzo Harris represented such a dramatic departure from his established screen persona that it fundamentally altered how audiences perceived him as an actor and challenged their assumptions about heroism, authority, and the nature of evil itself. The performance was so convincing and so disturbing that it forced viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily they could be manipulated by charismatic authority figures who used their power for corrupt purposes. The genius of Washington's performance lay in his ability to make Alonzo genuinely likable and persuasive, even as he was committing increasingly horrific acts. Unlike traditional movie villains who telegraph their evil intentions, Alonzo remained charming and seemingly rational throughout most of the film, making arguments for his methods that could sound reasonable if you weren't paying close attention to their ultimate implications. More than 2 decades after its release, Training Day remains relevant to ongoing discussions about police accountability and criminal justice reform, with new generations discovering the film and finding its themes as urgent as they were in 2001. The movie's unflinching examination of how good people can become monsters through institutional corruption continues to resonate in an era when questions about law enforcement accountability have become central to American political discourse. Anyway, that's it for the video, folks. Bye.